She was left at the station alone until the Lakota Chief took her hand. She realized he wasn't coming the exact moment the train doors slammed shut behind her, because every other passenger stepped into waiting arms, wagons, and warm greetings, while she stood alone on the cracking platform with a carpetbag that suddenly felt heavier than her whole past, the ticket he paid for, the letter he wrote, the promise he made. All lies falling apart in the dust around her as one by one the crowd thinned and whispers filled the empty space beside her boots. Poor girl. Left like that. And humiliation rose hot up her throat until she pressed her back to the station wall, trying not to cry, trying not to look as abandoned as she felt. She told herself she could still make a plan, still find a road, still disappear before the gossip grew teeth. But the world had already shifted beneath her, because bootsteps stopped, breath tightened, and the remaining townsfolk turned as a quiet ripple passed across the platform. At the far end, stepping out of the shadow like a truth the sun had been waiting to reveal, stood a Lakota Chief, tall, broad-shouldered, braids brushing his chest, turquoise beading glinting against worn leather, a man whose presence made the drifting dust pause in midair. His gaze locked onto her, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with the sharp, calm recognition of someone who understood what it meant to be left behind where no one should be left. He began walking toward her with the steady certainty of a man who had already made a decision, each step sending a new wave of whispers crawling through the station crowd. She swallowed hard and reached for her carpetbag just as a gust of wind knocked it from her hand and sent it tumbling across the planks. She rushed forward, but before she took 2 steps, the chief's hand reached down and caught it with effortless precision. When he straightened, the bag in his grip looked small against the strength of his fingers, and the way he held it, careful, respectful, made her breath hitch. He closed the distance between them until she could see the depth in his dark, steady eyes, a quiet storm of leadership and patience. He didn't ask why she was alone. He didn't demand to see papers or letters or explanations. He simply extended the carpetbag toward her and then extended his other hand, strong, unhurried, protective, his voice deep enough to settle the trembling that had been rising in her chest since the moment she stepped off the train. "You should not stand alone," he said, the words falling with the weight of truth rather than opinion. She froze, torn between fear and gratitude, between the sting of abandonment and the unfamiliar safety she felt radiating from the man before her. He waited, unmoving, unpressuring, until finally, when her fingers trembled in the air between them, he softened his gaze just enough to breathe warmth into the moment. "Walk with me," he added quietly, the offer sounding less like a command and more like a choice she had every right to make. And for the first time since the train whistle split the afternoon sky, she felt something new stirring beneath the humiliation. Not hope. Not yet. But something close to it, something steadier, something safe. He didn't take her hand right away. Instead, he waited for her to step toward him of her own will, standing steady as a mountain while the wind pulled at the edges of her dress and rattled the loose shingles above the ticket window. And when she finally moved, just one small step, he shifted his stance with a subtle, respectful ease, offering the carpetbag back and guiding her away from the wall without crowding her, a gesture that felt more protective than anything she had known in months. The platform around them crackled with curiosity as they walked, the few lingering travelers staring openly, some with softened expressions, and others with suspicion. But the chief's presence carved a quiet path that no one dared block. Even the station master paused mid-ledger, hat halfway raised as if he wanted to speak, but thought better of it. She kept her eyes on the worn boards beneath her boots, every heartbeat reminding her of the sting of abandonment, the shame she had tried so hard to leave behind, and she murmured, almost apologetically, "You don't have to," but he answered before she could finish, his voice deep and even. "A woman left alone is not a small thing, not here, not anywhere." His words settled over her like a blanket she had forgotten existed, warm and heavy and strangely steadying. They reached the far end of the platform, where the wind softened and the noise of the town melted into the low hum of wagon wheels on the main road. A pair of ranch boys leaning against a post straightened the moment they noticed the chief, nodding respectfully before stepping out of the way. She noticed that people did not simply look at him, they regarded him the way one regards a man whose judgment carries weight, whose silence means more than most men's speeches. When they reached the shadowed corner near the water pump, he set her carpetbag on the bench beside it and finally turned fully toward her, his expression unreadable but not cold. "Tell me," he said quietly, "who was meant to meet you?" She swallowed, her throat tight. "His name was Victor Gable. He sent me money for the ticket. A letter saying I'd have a home here." The chief studied her carefully, as if listening not just to her words, but to everything she didn't know how to say. "And he left you to be shamed in public." She nodded, embarrassment flooding her face. "I don't understand why. I wrote him honestly. I told him everything." The chief's brow tightened almost imperceptibly. "Some men read truth and walk away because they fear the weight of it." She blinked, surprised by the kindness stitched into that simple sentence. "You speak as if you've seen this before." "I have," he replied, "too many times." A wagon rattled past on the street beyond, its driver glancing over curiously before snapping the reins. The chief watched it disappear, then turned back to her. "You're not safe standing here. Word spreads fast. Men without honor look for women in despair." A shiver crawled up her spine because she knew he was right. She had lived long enough in towns like this to understand how quickly pity turned into opportunity for the wrong sort of men. "Come," he said, "I will take you to a place where you can breathe." She hesitated only long enough to whisper, "Why help me?" The chief didn't look away. "Because you were left alone," he said, "and in my people we do not let the abandoned stand without guard." Before she could respond, a sudden burst of laughter rolled from the saloon down the street, followed by a few harsh voices shouting about the girl left at the station. Her stomach twisted. The chief didn't flinch. He simply stepped half a pace in front of her, subtle, instinctive, protective, shielding her from the line of sight before extending his hand again, steady as the earth beneath them. "Walk with me," he repeated softly. And this time, shaking breath and trembling fingers and all, she placed her hand in his. His hand closed around hers, not with possession, but with a measured steadiness that felt more like shelter than grip. And as they stepped off the platform and into the sunlight, pooling along the main road, she felt the sharp edges inside her begin to soften for the first time since she boarded the train. The chief walked with a calm, deliberate pace, matching his stride to hers so she never had to hurry, never had to stumble to keep up. And the quiet power in that simple consideration made her chest tighten with something dangerously close to relief. The town watched, of course it did. Storefront doors cracked open, ranch hands paused mid-hammer or mid-water bucket, a few old-timers straightening from their chairs as if seeing a Lakota chief escorting a stranded woman was a kind of omen the wind had carried in. She kept her eyes low, but he noticed the tension in her shoulders and angled himself so his body blocked the worst of the stairs, guiding her toward the side road that curved around the livery and away from the saloon where cruel laughter had drifted earlier. The further they walked, the quieter it became. Wagon noise fading, gossip dying in the heat, wind brushing softly through cottonwoods until the world felt less harsh, less pointed. Only when they reached the split in the road where a worn fence bordered the outskirts of town did he release her hand so he could lift the gate latch. "We'll take the long path," he said. "It is safer, fewer eyes." She stepped through the gate, grateful for the space and the shade of the pines that lined the trail. "Do you live far?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No, my people camp along the river. We follow the land seasons." She hesitated, glancing at the distant hills. "Are they all right with strangers?" A faint smile flickered at the edge of his mouth, unexpected, gentle, there and gone like sunlight through trees. "My people judge character, not circumstance, and you carry no darkness." She swallowed hard, the words almost too kind to bear. The trail narrowed, curving around a low ridge where wild briars tangled along the ground. He guided her with a quiet hand at her elbow when the path sloped downward, not presuming, not clutching, simply steadying her when her boot slipped on loose gravel. "Thank you," she murmured. "You need not thank for simple decency," he replied, voice calm as riverstone. They walked in silence for several minutes until the faint sound of water met her ears, the soft rush of a creek. When the trail opened to a shallow crossing, the chief stepped into the water first, testing the stones with his heel before extending his hand again. "It is steady," he said. "But hold on." She did, and the moment her hand touched his, the panic that had lived in her ribs since the station eased, dissolving beneath the creek's cold spray and the warmth of his palm. On the other side, he guided her toward a fallen tree where she could rest. "Sit," he said. "You have walked far with fear in your breath. Let it go for a while." She sank onto the log, hands trembling in her lap. "I don't know why Victor didn't come," she whispered. "I told him everything, my past, my mistakes, what I hoped for. I thought honesty would keep me safe." The chief crouched nearby, elbows resting on his knees. "If he abandoned you after hearing truth, then he was never a man worth trusting." She blinked hard, tears threatening. Do you think he might return? That he could be looking for me now?" The chief's gaze sharpened with a quiet authority that silenced the wind around them. "If he comes, he will answer to me first." She inhaled sharply. "Why would you protect me like this?" He lowered his voice. "Because a woman left alone draws predators, because the world is harsher than it should be, and because the moment I saw you standing abandoned on that platform." His eyes held hers, steady and unafraid. "I knew you needed someone to stand between you and the world." Her breath hitched, not from fear this time, but from the strange, steady promise in his words. And as the creek whispered behind them and the late sunlight softened across the trees, she realized she wasn't breathing like someone abandoned anymore. She was breathing like someone beginning to feel safe. She didn't mean to tell him more, not here, not so soon. But something in the way he watched the trail ahead, alert but unhurried, present but never pressing, made words rise in her throat before she had the chance to swallow them back down. And by the time they reached a shaded bend along the river where tall reeds swayed in slow rhythm with the current, her chest felt too full to keep anything buried. He paused beneath an old cottonwood whose branches dipped low, offering her cool shade, and said gently, "Sit. Speak what burdens you." The invitation was soft, but it cut through her ribs like a key sliding into a long locked door. She lowered herself onto a smooth boulder near the water's edge, fingers knotting in her skirt as she tried to steady her voice. "Victor wasn't the first man to promise me a new start," she began, staring at the river instead of at him. "There was another, Jonas. I knew him from childhood. He offered marriage after my parents died. I thought he meant kindness. I thought he meant safety." She drew a shaky breath. "But once I lived in his house, he turned different, possessive, controlling. Every kindness he offered came with a price. Every mistake I made became a debt he said I owed." The chief remained silent, but the kind of silence that welcomed truth instead of choking it. She continued, voice trembling. "He told me no man would ever want me, that I should be grateful he kept a roof over my head. And when I tried to leave," her breath broke. "He locked me in a storage room for 2 days. Said a woman who walked away from him was a disgrace." The chief's jaw tightened, a slow, controlled flex that told her he was holding back a storm. "How did you get free?" he asked softly. "A neighbor heard me pounding on the wall," she whispered. "They pried the door open. I ran. I left everything behind." "And Jonas?" the chief asked. "He told people I was unstable, that I harmed myself, that he was only trying to help." She lifted her eyes finally, blinking back the heat behind them. "I believed Victor might give me a chance to breathe. I sent him the whole truth in a letter. I didn't want any more secrets." The chief stepped closer, not touching, but anchoring the space beside her with the steadiness of a man who understood how stories shaped wounds. "A man with honor," he said, "does not punish a woman for surviving." She swallowed. "Victor did. He must have. He didn't come. He didn't write. He didn't even ask if I arrived alive." Her voice cracked. "I must have scared him away." The chief crouched before her, the river light catching the beads across his chest as he met her eyes with a calm fierceness that felt like a shield rising around her. "Hear me," he said quietly. "Your truth is not a stain. Your escape is not shame. What you lived through does not make you unworthy. It makes you alive." Tears blurred her vision, falling before she could stop them. "I don't feel alive," she whispered. He softened, voice dropping low. "You will." A long breath trembled through her as she looked at him. Why do you care? He held her gaze without flinching. Because I have seen too many women driven into silence by men who fear their strength. Because your story is not the first I've heard, and because no one should bear it alone. She shook her head. I don't want to be a burden to your people. You are not, he said firmly. A traveler seeking safety is a guest. A woman fleeing cruelty is a truth-bearer. My people honor truth. The river shimmered with late afternoon light, and a soft breeze brushed her cheek as though the land itself agreed with him. For a moment she simply breathed, steady, slow, the kind of breath that hadn't come easily in months. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small but clearer. Thank you, she whispered. The chief rose and extended his hand, not demanding, simply offering the same choice he'd offered at the station. Walk with me, he said. Your past cannot chase you where honor stands. And for the first time, she believed him. They had barely walked another mile along the river road when the chief's posture shifted, subtle at first, the way his shoulders angled slightly toward the wind, the way his steps slowed just enough to listen beneath the normal sounds of rustling reeds and rushing water. She didn't notice it until he lifted one hand in a quiet signal, palm facing back toward her, and she froze instantly. Breath caught in her chest as he tilted his head toward the ridge above them. The birds had stopped singing. The wind changed direction. The world went still in the way it only did when danger was close enough to taste. The chief stepped forward, scanning the tree line with a focus so sharp it felt like another kind of vision. And then she heard it too, the distant clatter of hooves, not slow or wandering but purposeful, tightening through the pines like a threat riding on anger. She gripped the edge of her skirt. Chief? He didn't look back. Stay behind me, he said quietly, each word carrying the calm of a man who had weathered storms far greater than this moment. The hooves grew louder, descending the ridge in a scatter of gravel until 3 riders burst into view, hard-eyed, dust-covered, and carrying the kind of tension that made her stomach twist so violently she almost doubled over. Her breath failed her the moment she recognized the first man's posture, the cruel slope of his shoulders, the familiar sneer stretching across his mouth. Jonas, her former captor. The man who told the world she was unstable. The man who locked her in a room when she tried to leave. The man who believed he owned her. Jonas reined in his horse with a jerk, boots grinding against the earth as he dismounted, his eyes sweeping over her with a smirk that made her blood run cold. Well, he drawled, look at this. Little runaway got farther than I expected. One of the other men snickered. The chief stepped between them with a controlled, dangerous calm, his broad frame blocking Jonas's line of sight as cleanly as a gate slamming shut. She is not property, the chief said without raising his voice. Not yours, not anyone's. Jonas scoffed, circling to catch a glimpse of her around the chief's shoulder. Since when do Lakota Chiefs start collecting white women left at train stations? The chief didn't move. I collect nothing, he said evenly, but I guard against wolves. Jonas's smirk faltered. The other 2 riders stiffened. She lied to me, Jonas snapped, gesturing angrily. Told me she needed help, then tried to run off with my belongings. She choked on a breath. Your belongings? Jonas, you locked me in a room. For your safety, he snapped. You were hysterical. You still are. The chief took one deliberate step closer, the earth seeming to shift beneath his boots as he narrowed the distance between himself and Jonas. I heard her truth, he said, and I decide when dishonor walks too close. Jonas's face twisted. She owes me. She's coming back. No, the chief said, voice quiet but unbreakable. She is not. Jonas reached for her wrist, fast, arrogant, confident, but he never touched her. The chief's hand snapped up in an instant, catching Jonas's forearm mid-air with such force it drove his boot into the dirt. Jonas sucked in a breath. His men reached toward their guns on reflex, hands trembling more from fear of the chief than loyalty to Jonas. Careful, the chief warned without looking their way. Your weapons do not scare me. They shame you. The men hesitated, glancing uncertainly between Jonas and the chief. Jonas jerked his arm free, face blotching with fury and humiliation. This isn't over, he spat. I'll have the sheriff send her back. She's got a debt. She owes nothing, the chief cut in, and you will not speak to her again. Jonas's breath hitched with the beginning of fear, a fear he masked with bluster as he swung onto his horse. You just made yourself an enemy, Chief. I have enemies enough, the chief replied calmly. Jonas glared at her one last time, venom thick in his gaze, then kicked his horse hard and thundered up the ridge, his men following in a spray of dust. The moment they disappeared into the trees, her knees buckled. The chief caught her before she hit the ground. She shook violently, breath broken and uneven, as his hand steadied her shoulders. He cannot take you, the chief murmured, voice low and certain. Not while I stand. And for the first time in her life, she believed no man, not Jonas, not Victor, not any enemy from her past, could reach her through the shield now standing between her and the world. Her legs still trembled from the encounter when the chief guided her back toward the river trail, his hand steady on her elbow, not tightening, not urging, just anchoring her enough that the world didn't tilt under her feet. The air felt too thin, the sunlight too sharp, her heartbeat too loud. But the way he moved, slowly, deliberately, always scanning the ridge behind them, kept her from collapsing beneath the weight of fear Jonas had carved into her for years. We must reach my people before nightfall, the chief said, voice calm but edged with urgency. Jonas will seek allies. A coward gathers louder men to hide his own weakness. She nodded, breath still unsteady, but each step beside him loosened the tight coil in her chest, as though walking with him quieted a storm she carried everywhere she went. The trail widened as they descended into a valley where tall grasses swayed like waves, catching glittering light from the river's gentle bend, and she found herself glancing at the chief more than the path, at the way his jaw tightened each time the wind carried a distant echo, at the way he shifted his body subtly to the outside of every turn, at the way his presence alone made the open land feel far less dangerous than it should have. Are you afraid he'll return? She whispered. Jonas fears me, he said, but fear makes a man foolish, and foolish men return when they should flee. A shiver crawled across her spine, but before the panic could flare, he added, You are not unprotected. The reassurance sank deeper than she expected, warming the cold places Jonas had left in her bones. They walked for nearly an hour, crossing a meadow alive with wildflowers and the low buzz of summer insects, until the distant sound of drums drifted over the breeze, steady, rhythmic, a heartbeat carried through the land. Her steps faltered. Is that your people? He nodded once. A gathering. The spirits are honored today. It is good timing. Good timing? She whispered, unsure whether she should fear or trust what waited ahead. A woman seeking safety is always welcome. They climbed the last rise, and the view opened into a sweeping plateau where dozens of painted teepees formed a grazing crescent around a central fire pit. Smoke curled gently into the sky, and horses grazed freely along the perimeter, their coats gleaming under the late afternoon sun. She froze at the sight, not from fear, but from awe. There was life here, movement, warmth. Children racing barefoot through the grass, women grinding corn near low tables, elders seated in a half-circle listening to a storyteller whose hands moved like wind-blown leaves. The world she stepped into was whole, intact in ways her life had never been, and yet familiar in its gentleness. The chief slowed so she could take it in without being overwhelmed. Do not fear their eyes, he murmured. They look because you are new, not because you are unwanted. She swallowed. But I'm not Lakota. I don't belong to this place. He turned toward her fully, his face softened by an understanding she hadn't earned but desperately needed. Belonging is not a matter of blood, he said. It is a matter of truth, and truth walks with you. They descended toward the encampment, and the first person to greet them was an elderly woman with silver braids and a face lined with wisdom. She studied the chief, then the woman beside him, then the chief again. She was left alone, he said simply. The elder nodded, her gaze warm. Then she stands with us. A child ran up, barefoot, laughing, and grabbed the chief's leg before darting away, leaving a small handprint of dust on his trousers. For the first time since the station, she felt something rise inside her that wasn't fear. Hope, small and trembling, but alive. The chief noticed her quiet smile, and something in his expression softened. Not a smile, not yet, but a gentling of stern lines that made her breath catch. You will rest, he said. You will eat. And when the fire is lit tonight, you will speak your truth to those who honor it. Her voice shook. Will they believe me? Yes, the chief said, because I already do. He guided her toward the circle of warmth and watchful eyes, and as the drums deepened into an evening rhythm, she stepped into a world where she was not hunted, not shamed, not abandoned. For the first time in her life, she stepped into safety. The encampment quieted as the sun sank behind the ridge, painting the plains in copper and rose, and while the women prepared food near the central fire and children chased one another through the tall grass with wooden sticks for horses, the chief guided her toward a smaller lodge set apart from the others, not isolated, but respected, its painted hide marked with symbols she didn't yet understand. As he held the flap open for her to step inside, she felt a flicker of unease, not fear exactly, but the disorienting awareness that she was crossing into a space no outsider entered lightly. The interior glowed with warm firelight that licked gently across carved poles, woven blankets, and bundles of herbs hanging from the roof. The air smelled of cedar and sweetgrass, grounding her trembling pulse as she folded her hands and stepped closer to the warmth. The chief entered behind her, and for a moment he said nothing, merely crouched near the fire pit, adding a piece of dry wood with the same quiet strength he'd shown since the moment they met at the station. When he finally looked up, the firelight reflected off his eyes, softening the stern lines of his face. There is something you must understand, he said. Before you speak your truth tonight, you must hear mine. Her breath stalled. Your truth? He nodded once and settled onto a low wooden stool, gesturing for her to sit across from him. She lowered herself slowly, unsure why her heart suddenly beat with an anxious rhythm. My people follow a chief who listens before he decides, he began, voice low, calm, weighted. But a man is not born a chief. He must earn the right through loss, through service, through burdens he does not pass to others. She watched him carefully as he continued. 3 summers ago, raiders struck our hunting camp while part of my band was away. My younger brother died, defending our mother. My sister was taken for 3 days before we found her. And our old chief, my uncle, was wounded beyond healing. Her breath hitched. I'm so sorry. His final order, the chief said quietly, was that I take his place. He looked down at his hands, turning them palm up near the fire. These hands were not meant for leadership. They were meant for hunting, for carving, for the quiet work of a man who speaks rarely and listens more. She blinked, startled by the vulnerability he revealed so plainly. But you lead well, she whispered. I have seen it. He shook his head once, slow, measured. I lead because my people needed someone who could not be bent by grief, someone whose heart had already been closed to loss. Her chest tightened. Closed, his eyes held hers, steady but shadowed. A chief with a broken heart can still rule, but a chief with an open one risks his people. She drew a slow breath, understanding threading painfully through her nerves. So you closed yours. I buried what was left of it beneath duty, he said, so no one else would be lost beneath my watch. They sat in a long silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of night settling around the lodge. When he spoke again, his voice carried a truth he had not yet named. But when I stepped onto that station platform today and saw you standing alone, something moved in me that had not moved in years. Her throat tightened. Why? His gaze didn't waver. Because you looked like someone the world had pushed aside and expected not to stand again, and I know what it feels like to lose what cannot be replaced. She inhaled sharply, tears stinging at the corners of her eyes. I thought strength was only shown in silence, she whispered. You have shown me otherwise. He leaned slightly closer, enough that the space between them felt like a held breath. You believe your past makes you weak, he said. I tell you this, truth spoken in fear is still truth spoken with honor. A soft knock rattled the lodge flap, and a young woman's voice called, Chief, the fire circle gathers. He rose, offering his hand again, not commanding, not insisting, but inviting her into a world that had already begun making room for her. Tonight, he said softly, You will not speak alone. I stand with you." And as she placed her trembling hand in his, she felt the unmistakable shift of something long buried, his heart and hers, beginning, cautiously, to open. Night settled over the encampment in a deep blue hush, the stars blinking awake one by one, as if they too were gathering to witness what was about to unfold. And by the time the chief guided her toward the fire circle at the center of the camp, the drums had softened into a low heartbeat that pulsed through the earth beneath her boots. People formed a wide ring around the flames, elders with braids silver as moonlight, warriors with arms crossed in silent vigilance, mothers holding sleeping children, young hunters with faces lit by shifting firelight. And every gaze traveled briefly to her as she stepped into the warm glow. Not judging, not suspicious, curious, attentive. The chief's presence beside her changed the air instantly. Conversations dimmed, movement slowed. Even the restless flicker of flames seemed to steady as he lifted his chin, acknowledging those who had already seen enough hardship to recognize the shape of fear in her shoulders. He didn't push her forward. He simply stood at her side, broad frame forming a wall of calm strength, his hand hovering near hers but not touching, giving her space to breathe before the truth she'd carried for too long finally found a voice. The eldest council member, a man whose eyes carried more years than the lines on his face, stepped closer with a ceremonial staff. "She comes with a burden," he said. "She comes with danger behind her." His gaze shifted to the chief. "And you bring her here under your protection." The chief nodded. "Her past hunts her, a man with cruelty in his hands and lies on his tongue." A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft, angry, protective. The elder turned to her then. "Speak what must be spoken," he said. "Truth loses its power only when buried." Her breath trembled in her chest like a trapped bird. She looked at the flames, their edges wavering like her courage. But when she felt the chief step half a pace closer, not touching, merely anchoring, her voice found its strength. She told them everything. Jonas's possessiveness, the room he locked her in, the way he made her believe she was worthless without him. She spoke of Victor's letters, the promise of safety that turned to abandonment at the station, the shame of standing alone while the town watched. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. Not this time, not with a ring of firelight holding her truth steady. When she finished, the world didn't collapse around her like she always feared it would. Instead, silence settled, thick, heavy, contemplative, before breaking with the soft, steady voice of an elder woman. "A man who harms a woman's spirit is no man," she said. "A man who cages her is already less than the dust beneath her feet." Warriors murmured in agreement. One young hunter stepped forward, jaw tight. "If he comes here," he said, "he will not walk into our camp as predator. He will crawl out as nothing." A quiet wave of assent swept through the circle. She felt her throat close, not with fear, but with a kind of gratitude she didn't know how to hold. The elder councilman turned to the chief. "You brought her here. Her truth is now ours to guard." The chief nodded once, a gesture both solemn and fierce. "No harm will pass me to reach her," he said. "Not from Jonas, not from any man who seeks power through fear." Then, unexpectedly, he shifted, not toward the council, but toward her, lowering his head just enough that the firelight pooled across his braids and cast his face in warm gold. "Your story does not shame you," he said softly, but loud enough that all could hear. "It reveals the cowardice of the men who hurt you, and the strength of the woman who survived them." Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet, unhidden, and for the first time in her life, she didn't wipe them away in embarrassment. She let them fall, let them glow in the firelight like proof that she was still standing. The elder lifted his staff. "Then it is decided," he said. "Tonight she is under our protection. Her truth is honored, her safety is our charge." The circle murmured their agreement in low, unified voices, and when she looked up at the chief again, something in his eyes had shifted, not softened exactly, but opened, the way a locked door opens when someone knocks with a truth too strong to ignore. As the drums resumed, slow, steady, protective, she realized the fire hadn't judged her, the people hadn't judged her. This man hadn't judged her. For the first time, the world had listened and believed her. The fire circle had only just begun to settle into a lull, drums softening, elders murmuring in low voices, children sleepy against their mothers' shoulders, when the chief's posture changed so sharply that even the flames seemed to tighten. He turned his head toward the dark ridge beyond the camp, his breath slowing, eyes narrowing with the instinct of a man who sensed danger long before it showed its face. She felt it too, a shift in the air, a tremor of unease sliding down her spine as the night wind carried a faint sound. Hoofbeats, distant but fast, too fast for travelers, too sharp for hunters returning late. The chief lifted one hand, and the entire fire circle stilled as though the land itself obeyed him. Warriors rose from their places with quiet efficiency, drawing back toward the perimeter, hands resting on bows, spears, and blades that gleamed faintly under the moon. She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling at her sides. "Is it him?" she whispered. "Jonas?" The chief didn't answer, but his jaw tightened with a grim certainty that told her he already knew. Moments later, the hoofbeats broke through the trees. 3 riders, same as before, but this time their approach carried an arrogance sharpened by anger. Jonas appeared first, his silhouette illuminated by the firelight as he jerked his horse to a halt at the camp's edge, his face twisted by fury and humiliation. "So this is where you ran," Jonas spat, sliding from his saddle with a swagger that masked the tremor in his hands. "Hiding among savages." A quiet growl rippled through the warriors nearest him, not loud, but deadly. The chief stepped forward, placing himself between Jonas and the fire circle. His presence alone enough to draw the eyes of every Lakota present. "You will not enter this camp," the chief said, voice low but carrying like a drumbeat across the valley. Jonas sneered. "I'm not here for you." His gaze snapped to her, sharp, possessive, hateful. "I'm here for what's mine." She flinched, breath catching in her throat, and the chief moved half a step closer, blocking Jonas's view so completely that she saw nothing but his braids, his shoulders, the carved line of his spine, his body a shield the way he'd promised. "She is not yours," the chief said. Jonas barked a laugh, loud and brittle. "The law says otherwise. A man has a right to retrieve what belongs to him. She stole from me. She lied to me. She owes me her presence at my side." "She owes you nothing," the chief replied, calm as stone. "And you owe her the truth, though I doubt you have ever spoken it." Jonas's face reddened. "You think you can keep her? You think your people can hide her from the sheriff, from the law?" The chief took one slow step forward, and the firelight flared against the beads across his chest, casting a copper sheen over the sharp line of his jaw. "Law is not a weapon for men who fear their own weakness," he said, "and it will not save you here." Jonas opened his mouth, ready to retort, but one of his own riders shifted uneasily beside him, voice low. "Jonas, maybe we should go. This ain't our ground." Jonas snapped. "Shut up, she comes with me." The chief's next words fell like a warning carried by the earth itself. "Touch her," he said, "and you will not leave this place upright." A ripple of tension rippled through the camp, not from fear, but from readiness. The warriors nearest Jonas raised their weapons, each movement fluid, practiced, patient. Jonas's bravado faltered. For the first time he hesitated, glancing around him as if realizing the firelight did not illuminate a frightened frontier camp. It illuminated a united nation, one he could not break with lies or force. Still, pride drove him forward. He thrust his chest out, jabbing a finger toward her. "You can't hide behind them forever." She found her voice, quiet, shaking, but true. "I'm not hiding," she said. "I'm standing with people who don't hurt me." Jonas's mouth twisted, rage rising fast and foolish. He grabbed her arm, too fast for her to react, but the world snapped into motion before fear could flood her chest. The chief's hand caught Jonas's wrist with a speed she couldn't see. Only here, the raw crack of bone shifting under pressure as Jonas gasped, collapsing to one knee. "Enough," the chief said, voice deep and resonant, every syllable a verdict. Jonas wheezed in pain. "You'll pay for this." "No," the chief answered. "You will." He pushed Jonas backward, not violently, but with a force that sent him stumbling until his own horse shied away from him. His riders backed up too, hands raised as if embarrassed to be seen beside him. "Leave," the chief commanded, And do not return to this ground with lies in your mouth. We honor truth here." Jonas glared, clutching his injured wrist, humiliation blanching his face. But he saw it. The united camp, the weapons ready, the chief unflinching, and fear finally drowned his pride. He swung onto his horse with difficulty, spitting one last threat into the dirt. "This isn't over." The chief's voice was calm. "For you, it is." Jonas fled into the darkness, his riders following without a backward glance, the hooves fading into the night until the valley returned to its quiet drumbeat. Only then did the chief turn to her, his breath steady, his eyes searching her face for fear, for hurt, for anything he could shield. She exhaled shakily, tears gathering in her eyes, not from terror, but from the overwhelming truth that no man had ever stood for her like that. "You're safe," the chief murmured. "Here, you're safe." And for the first time, she felt the words settle not in her ears, but in her bones. Long after Jonas and his riders vanished into the darkness and the last echoes of hooves faded beyond the ridge, the fire circle slowly returned to life in a softer, calmer rhythm. Drums lowered to a heartbeat's whisper, conversation settling into a warm hum, the night air cooling enough for the stars to pierce through like tiny silver prayers scattered across the sky. She remained near the chief, her pulse still unsteady, though not from fear anymore, but from the weight of everything that had been lifted off her by the hands of people who didn't even know her yesterday. Warriors dispersed to the perimeter again, watchful but relaxed in the knowledge that danger had been driven off, and some of the women approached with bowls of warm stew, offering her food with eyes full of understanding, not pity. She took the bowl with trembling hands, and one of the elder women laid a gentle palm on her shoulder, saying, "You are safe under this sky." She nearly cried at how simply the words were given. No condition, no warning, no doubt. The chief guided her away from the fire as the circle resumed its slow drumbeat, leading her toward a quieter part of the encampment where the river's whisper threaded through the grass like a lullaby. He didn't speak at first, letting her finish eating while she stared at the water glinting under the moonlight. When she finally set the empty bowl aside and wiped her hands on her skirt, he lowered himself to sit beside her on a broad, flat stone, his presence steady and grounding. "You stood in truth tonight," he said. "Many do not have the courage." She looked down at her hands, surprised by how steady they felt now. "I've been running for so long, I didn't know what it felt like to stop." "You have stopped," he said softly, "and you are among people who walked through storms of their own." She breathed deeply, the night air cool and sweet, mixing with the faint scent of cedar from the camp. "I thought Jonas would take everything from me," she whispered. "My name, my chance at a life, my voice." The chief turned his head, studying her profile with an intensity that didn't frighten her. It steadied her. "He no longer holds anything," he said. "Your path moved beyond him the moment you stepped from that train." She swallowed hard. "And you, why did you step forward?" For the first time, something like vulnerability flickered across his face. Quiet, restrained, but real. "Because every time I have failed to act, the world has taken someone it should not have," he said. "And because when I saw you alone, something in me recognized a spirit that had not yet been broken, only bruised." Her breath trembled. "I feel different," she said. "Like I'm breathing in a place that wants me here." "My people accept you," he said. "And tonight, the council accepted your truth." She nodded slowly, the full meaning of that settling deeper than she expected. "What happens now?" His answer came without hesitation. "If you choose to stay, you will have a place, a lodge to rest, work among us if you wish, protection always." Her chest tightened with emotion too big to swallow. "And with you?" she whispered. He exhaled softly, as though the question touched a place he rarely allowed anyone near. "If you walk with me," he said, "you walk with a man who stands where he promises, a man who does not leave what he chooses to guard." She felt warmth bloom behind her ribs, slow and steady. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his palm upward between them, offering a choice without pressure, without expectation, the same gesture he'd made at the station. But it meant more now, everything more. The river shimmered, the drums quieted, the stars seemed to lean closer, and with a breath that felt like her first true one in years, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers gently, reverently, as though holding something sacred. "You took my hand when I had no place to stand," she whispered, "and you walked beside me when my past came to claim me." He lifted their joined hands slightly, letting the moonlight catch on their skin. "And I will walk beside you," he said, "as long as you choose to stay." A soft sound escaped her, a laugh mixed with a sob, and she leaned into him, just enough for her shoulder to touch his. He didn't pull away. He didn't stiffen. He simply accepted her weight, her warmth, her trust. For the first time in her life, she belonged, not through someone else's ownership, but through her own choice and the honor of a man who saw her spirit before her wounds. And when he finally spoke again, voice deep as nightfall, it felt like a promise the whole valley could hear. "You are not alone," he murmured. "Not now, not ever again." Some journeys end not where the train stops, but where the truth is finally believed. If this story reached your heart, like, share, and subscribe to Redemption West, where honor stands tall, mercy speaks louder than fear, and every soul earns a second sunrise.